I think we can start now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. And also I extend the greetings on the occasion of the World Environment Day. As all of you know, since 1974, June 5th is observed as the World Environment Day. And from 1987, the concept of host country was introduced to get focus and rotate around the world. So this year, this day is hosted by Colombia in partnership with Germany. And due to the pandemic situation, most of the countries, most of the activities are online happening, many people sitting at home. And also, as you are aware, the biodiversity, time for nature, is the theme for this year. And I think it is the most appropriate theme for this year. One of the reasons is in 2010-11, the UN declared the UN Decade for Biodiversity. So this year, 2020, the decade is concluding. Also, this is very important because the biodiversity which describe the life on Earth is facing extinction. Many of the species are facing extinction, and we have started facing the consequence of that. And also in the context of the pandemic, the importance of preserving biodiversity is underlined. I'm not taking much time. We have 5 speakers in the webinar today. We have the Secretary General of CUTS International, Mr. Pradeep Mehta, joining with us. He will be delivering the opening address. And we have 4 other speakers. Anubha Prasad is representing UNEP. She is the National Coordinator of PAGE, Partnership for Action on Green Economy. And also we have Maria joining from Stockholm, who is a Senior Policy Officer at the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation based in Stockholm. Also, Naomi Scott is joining with us, representing the Consumers International. So to begin with, I invite Mr. Pradeep Mehta for briefly delivering his opening address. Over to Mr. Mehta.
Thank you, George. I hope you could unmute all others so that there is no disturbance. Let me also join George in welcoming you all to this webinar on a very important occasion, which we've been celebrating for long, and yet we are still, our goals are still very elusive. Let me go back to June 1992, when the Convention on Biodiversity was adopted at Rio de Janeiro during the Earth Summit. It was a very interesting experience that I had. And therefore, I must share it, especially for all those who may not be aware. But there was a very big debate on the adoption of the Convention on Biodiversity. And there was, I still remember our minister then, Environment Minister Kamal Nath, speaking about the US President and the Vice President, the George Bush Sr. and Danny Quayle. And Kamal Nath made that very snide remark, or tongue-in-cheek remark, that we are talking about bushes and quails in terms of protection of biodiversity. The US White House raised a big objection on it, on this snide remark that Kamal made at the Prime Minister's office. But be that as it may, that it struck home. Now, what was also interesting about the Earth Summit was that there were 104 heads of government or states wanted to make a speech. And each was allotted 9 minutes each over 2 days to make their statement. And surprises of all possible surprises that you can think of, Fidel Castro, then President of Cuba, who was known for speaking on a marathon basis for hours and hours, spoke for exactly 1.5 minutes. what he said was very important for us even today, is that when we are talking about conservation of biodiversity, then we are looking at the Homo sapien, the human being. And let's not forget the human being in this whole atmosphere. And surprisingly, even George Bush Sr. Was forced to applaud his very, very pertinent remark. George Bush ended up speaking for about 11 minutes. So you can well imagine what was the kind of discipline which existed at that point of time. Now, when we talk in terms of the relationship between the biodiversity issues and the pandemic, it's all very well documented in the sense that the kind of imbalances which are happening in nature due to our consumption patterns, due to our living styles, is something which there is a shake-up call. And I'm glad that, I'm glad in a sense that this global pandemic, which is probably the biggest tragedy which I have seen in my lifetime, and in a global sense, has shaken us up. Now, how far we are able to get this message across in terms of particularly revisiting capitalism. Capitalism was supposed to be the way forward. Mind you, in the philosophy of cuts, we follow a middle road. We are neither neoliberal, neither left or the center. We believe that open markets are important and that liberalization is also important, but with safety nets. Having said that, what we are currently struggling with is what is the kind of economic resilience which will be required in order to come out of this pandemic situation, which has broken the backs of the economy. Just before this conversation started, Anuba and Maria were speaking about how Sweden is approaching it, that the lockdown is not there at all. Now, in India, we've had this problem. There's a very serious debate which is going on that the lockdown was announced very subtly, with the result that we did not look at livelihoods. We were only concerned with lives. But there has to be a balance between lives and livelihoods. And therefore, when I say lives and livelihoods, it means you're looking at the totality of the ecosystem as such. If you look at a Venn diagram, you're looking at economy, ecology, as well as equity. And in that Venn diagram, again, where we have found the center of sustainable development in the crossing where all the three circles meet, is something which we'll have to revisit again as to how do we manage what we have landed up into. With that, let me thank you all once again on behalf of CUTS and to welcome you to this webinar. And we hope that we have a good, interesting event which will be noteworthy. And we are recording, as you would notice. Therefore, the discussions would be available for posterity as well. Thank you very much. George, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Mehta. Thank you for taking us back to 1992 Earth Summit and also underlining the relationship between the biodiversity and the pandemic, the need for conserving the biodiversity in dealing with the pandemic like this. Thank you once again. Now I invite Anupa. Anupa will be speaking on economics of ecosystem and biodiversity. Over to you, Anupa.
Thanks, George. Am I audible clearly?
Yes.
Audible as well?
Yeah.
So, a very happy World Environment Day. And I also wish to thank George and CUTS International for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this esteemed panel. Biodiversity is not my core area of expertise. I worked as a green banker and I work on inclusive green economies. However, there is strong convergence. So let me ask you this question. A Kashmiri stag, a one-horned rhino, a great Indian bustard, or a Gangetic dolphin. What is common to all of them? And for that matter, between a bird's foot plant, an umbrella tree, or an ebony tree. So we all know that these all used to be common sites in India in their natural habitats, but not anymore. These and many more are now critically endangered, and some 1 million species are threatened with extinction worldwide. But there are many reasons for this: illegal wildlife poaching, trade, and we saw a very brutal instance of this, I guess 2-3 days back. And there is a severe reduction in habitats, pollution, especially in waterways, unsustainable resource consumption, and of course the menace of climate change. So there are many reasons, but there is one common factor, and it is us, the humans, the carpe diem species. And such strange are our ways that the nature bounces back if we are in lockdown for even a fortnight. And we all have experience of this, especially in India with cleaner waters and clearer airs. That when we lose nature, we lose much more than the spectacle of an animal sighting. Biodiverse, well-balanced ecosystems are fundamental to even to human existence. So plants and animals in ecosystems are linked to each other through food chain and food web. The loss of one species in the ecosystem can spell the doom for other species as well. So when we lose nature, we lose pollination by animals like bats and bees, and pest control from insect predators. This means that we have less food. When we lose nature, we lose water and air purification from trees, grasslands, and other natural filters. This means that water we drink and air we breathe is less healthy. When we lose nature, we lose barriers to erosion and natural disasters and carbon sequestration from forests, peatlands, and mangroves. We lose soil formation and nutrient recycling. We lose natural defense against zoonotic diseases, COVID-19 being a case in point. And that means that we are setting ourselves up for crisis. So almost half the world of the global GDP, it's 44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. And this is even more pronounced in India, that more than 70% of those living in poverty, they depend at least in part on natural resources to earn their livelihoods. So for the sake of our existence and that of coming generations, we need to act now. And that is why this World Environment Day, the United Nations has declared that it is time for nature. So today we are losing nature faster than it can restore itself. So let us talk about the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity as a concept and also as a project. The natural capital underpins human existence and economic systems. Yet we see that the value of natural resources is not recognized by the markets. They are taken for granted and still far from being a serious consideration in financing and investment decisions. It is not even counted as part of GDP. We know that the agriculture sector, because the project and the concept that I'm talking about is more from an agricultural standpoint. So we know that agriculture is fundamental to our existence. It provides foods, raw materials, feeds, etc., etc. However, it is also a leading driver for ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, health externalities, GHG emissions, etc. So the negative and positive impacts are economically invisible. Hence, they are unaccounted for in public and private decision making, which is not a very desirable situation. So valuation of ecosystem services is important to make nature's values visible, measurable, and to drive investment decisions to public and private sector through different kind of mechanisms like incentives and price signals and revamping the subsidy regime and reforming the harmful subsidies, etc., and tax incentives, of course. So let's try to understand it a bit. The agriculture value chain comprises of human system, agricultural system, and natural systems, which are intertwined. So human systems contribute technology, labor, other inputs, and in turn, they receive benefits like livelihood, food, raw material, etc. The agriculture system includes agriculture production, manufacturing, distribution, retail, consumption, etc. And there is a natural system which contributes biodiversity, pollination, soil, pest control, and other ecosystem services. And the natural system is a recipient of biodiversity loss, habitat loss, soil degradation, salinity, and other impacts. So while the human system and the agriculture system are economically valued, the valuation of natural system and the losses that it suffers are neither measured nor valued in either monetary or non-monetary terms. So it is imperative to have a framework in which these ecosystem services are measured and valued, and we devise optimal agricultural ecosystem in the all the three, systems. So if we talk about Punjab, which we call the granary of India, and we call about the very obvious example of the wheat value chain in Punjab. So it contributes to 18% of India's wheat production, but it is characterized by crop monocultures, subsidized access to energy, water, fertilizer, pesticides, etc., and very increased use of fertilizer. And 6 decades post the Green Revolution, they have seen growth in agricultural production by exponential growth. However, there is also the economies of diminishing returns are setting in, and there is a severe loss which is at times irreparable, and it has severe health consequences as well. So can we quantify and compare the conventional and organic wheat production? And can we examine the prevailing policy context of many subsidies for energy, water, pesticide, fertilizer, or a context of direct benefit transfer to farmers, and arrive at an optimal scenario wherein there is the optimal solution to this problem? So this is an interesting initiative. I'll just give you a very brief overview. So this is the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity, or TEEB as we call it in short. It's a global initiative. It is focused on making nature's value visible. So the principal objective is to mainstream the value of biodiversity and the ecosystem services into decision-making at all levels. So we have to recognize, demonstrate, and then capture the value of an ecosystem and biodiversity in both monetary and non-monetary terms. This is underway in several countries like Brazil, India, Kenya, Colombia, Tanzania, Thailand, Malaysia, etc., etc. And this aims to bring all stakeholders together, followed by modeling impacts of land use, assessing subsequent changes in ecosystem, servicing provisioning, and valuing them, so that they can be part of economic calculus of policymakers. So it will provide policy recommendations considering the whole value chain. And it will also bring the champions and the agribusinesses together. So today, when with all the trouble that COVID-19 has brought upon the world, we might assume that the environment cannot be a high priority as we recover. And as we've seen the 10% of GDP package of the government of India, the 20 lakh crore package, it hardly mentions about the environment. But this would be misguided. If we think that environment is not important in this recovery and rebooting, this would be it's not a good idea to go along with. So this is rather an opportunity for us to build back better. Trillions of dollars and billions of here in India are being deployed in COVID-19. So let us make these funds contribute to a greener, cleaner, and healthier India. And let us put into consideration the natural ecosystem adds to our economic activity. So thank you so much. And thanks again, George and Cuts International, for having me here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anubha. To begin with, explaining the functions of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is important for the existence of the human being. Then in detail explaining about the economics of the ecosystem and the biodiversity, especially taking the agriculture sector as the example, and talking about the agriculture value chain, and also underlining the need for mainstreaming the value of biodiversity. We will come back and take up questions later. Thank you. Let me now invite Maria.
Thanks, George.
Maria will be talking about the land use change and its implications on the biodiversity and humans. And she also will be touching the linkage with the pandemic. Over to Maria.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting webinar, and also to be able to listen to you and speak to you. I will give a short introduction for the discussion on the theme of land use change. Environmental degradation now affects our lives in ways that are becoming impossible to ignore, from food to jobs to security, and also health, which we are now experiencing in in a way with the pandemic, with COVID-19, and it comes to a very high cost. We are losing lives. And for a long time, biodiversity has had a second place after climate. When the EPAS report came last May, maybe the scene changed a bit, where we actually focused on the loss of 1 million species. So we are losing out at a very high speed. And just today, SSC published an article on the fact that the biodiversity crisis is as big as the climate crisis and has to be acknowledged at the same scale, because we are so much depending on it for our survival. And I would say even the economic aspects on losing biodiversity has been highlighted. In January, the World Economic Forum, for example, launched an initiative to plant 1 trillion trees. Not going into details about what type of trees or how to plant, but still the loss of biodiversity is highlighted at several different platforms right now. There are two main drivers of the loss of biodiversity: land use change and direct exploitation. And I will use tropical forest as an example, since I'm working with that with our partners globally, and which is very well exemplifying the way we are losing biodiversity, which is the branch we're sitting on, and we are cutting it in a very high speed. When we deforest, we also minimize the buffer zones. We will live in a context of zoonotic diseases increasing. Some researchers say that the COVID-19, despite the severeness, is a light pandemic that we're experiencing right now. So if this continues, the fragmentation of ecosystems, deforestation, and we're losing out of buffer zones between wildlife and humans, the situation could be much more severe within the nearby future. And the four main root causes for deforestation is actually very well linked to food and food production, because it's soy, palm oil, it's beef, and of course also logging. So I mean, the way we are building up our food production and at the same time causing deforestation and loss of biodiversity is causing a multiplied scenario of problems. We have a sustainable development goal for this year, goal 15.2, to halt deforestation. And we are experiencing a completely different situation with deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, which is skyrocketing right now, more than 9,000 square kilometers during the last 12 months. And that is an increase of 85%, despite all the initiatives that also business is taking. So I think we need to see it in a more holistic perspective. How do we address the loss of biodiversity and what are the driving forces? Indonesia, for example, is interesting with the loss of arable land into palm oil plantations that are now reaching the horizon. It wasn't barren land before. It was either community forest or farmers' land rich in biodiversity, because biodiversity also linked to a secure food production. Without biodiversity, we cannot produce food in a diversified way. And just to give you an example, of the total biomass of all mammals on Earth right now, 60% is livestock, 36% is human, and only 4% are wild animals, mammals. And I think that gives a very good picture on the way we are moving towards, where we're turning into more monoculture way of producing either meat or food, or we produce soy in order to feed our livestock, which is in the long term, of course, not sustainable. And we need to think of the role of business, of course, that set up these models and also take away land from farmers and include them in their production line. And right now, in the light of COVID-19, we see people are starving because they've given up their arable land and they used to work as daily labor on the plantations in order to gain cash to buy their food. But in the long-term perspective, and in the scenario of both the biodiversity loss and the climate crisis, of course, this is not a viable way of a livelihood. And we were talking about livelihood, we heard about livelihood and the value of livelihood, which is so important because it's also about people's survival, people's welfare, but it's also linked to biodiversity, keeping healthy ecosystems, because that will give us life and food and health. And I just think what we need to acknowledge is that also the role of indigenous people and local communities in managing biodiversity. 30% of the protected areas, they include the very high biodiversity, which is managed by indigenous people. They only acknowledge 10% in terms of tenure rights by their governments, but just to exemplify how important local communities and indigenous people are in managing biodiversity, because of their presence, because of their way of using forest and land, biodiversity has been kept for generations. And that is one way to go, of course, to secure biodiversity. And we talk about 30% protected forests globally as target for the new framework for the global Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on Biodiversity framework, which is right now being negotiated, although postponed a year due to the pandemic. And we need to look into the different ways of seeing protection. Protection is not only natural parks or reserves, it's also the way that people have managed land and forest for generations that keep the biodiversity. And forests are linked to the arable land outside. So the way we treat forests and ecosystems linked to forests, the way that would also have a trickle-down effect on the way we are able to farm. The biodiversity that we can keep on arable land, and the variety of crops that we can actually produce, and the living streams, the water is clean and provide farmers with arable land. And I think what we need to focus more about is also the way that environment and human rights are interlinked. We just heard David Boyd last week at the SSNC seminar. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. And he emphasized that if we would have a right-based approach to the way we work, we would have reached our targets within the work of biodiversity much faster. So we need to balance the way that we see the role of business, the role of farmers, the role of us as consumers, in order to be able to reach a sustainable development and keep the biodiversity. And right now at the EU level, we discuss the need for binding regulation. It's not enough with voluntary schemes anymore. We cannot leave it solely to the consumers to decide whether the product that I buy in my shop is produced in a sustainable way or not. So what we are now discussing is a legally binding framework for human rights due diligence and also for environmental due diligence, in order to put a framework which is not negotiable, but could also be a very strong tool for business when they do their procurements. And that will also actually enable us to reach our target within the Convention on Biodiversity, and also to keep a healthy and safe environment for people. And I think that would be
Maria, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you be brief?
Yeah, that is just my ending point. I think that would be in the focus now when we talk about biodiversity and when we negotiate the new framework for the Convention on Biodiversity post-2020 biodiversity framework, to have a more holistic approach to the way we work.
Thank you, Maria. Mainly explaining the consequence of losing the biodiversity, mainly to the land use changes and the direct use by the human beings, and how we losing the buffer zone is resulting in pandemic like COVID-19 and things like that. You also have highlighted the economic aspect and the importance of the Convention on Biodiversity and things like that. We will come back with questions later. Now I invite Naomi, who is the Sustainable Consumption Manager at Consumers International, to talk about the consumers and the biodiversity. Over to Naomi.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for the introduction and happy World Environment Day to you all. Thanks for the invitation to join today, and today I'm going to speak about consumers and the link between biodiversity. As we've spoken about today, the theme is for nature and how can consumers act. So recent evidence has really shown that consumers are increasingly forming habits in line with sustainable consumption. And according to Google search patterns, over the past 90 days and the global lockdowns due to the pandemic, there's been a huge soaring in the search term, how to live a sustainable lifestyle. It's increased by more than 4,550%. And biodiversity conservation is such an important component of sustainable consumption. So consumers can be powerful actors in helping to preserve biodiversity, but the choices that consumers make to help preserve biodiversity need to be easy. And the organisation that I work for, Consumers International, it's a global advocacy organisation for consumer groups worldwide, and we argue that sustainable consumption needs to be the easy choice for consumers. And information on products and services can be a really valuable way of helping consumers to make decisions that are in line with sustainable consumption and protecting biodiversity. But at the moment, the information that's out there for consumers is not always clear or actionable, and this can lead to a lot of confusion for consumers. And eco-labels can be a really important way, and voluntary sustainability standards, for showing to consumers what products are good for biodiversity. Two of the most famous eco-labels in the world are actually about biodiversity conservation. So that's the Marine Stewardship Council logo, the MSC logo. It's a blue fish that appears on sustainable seafood products. And then there's also the Rainforest Alliance logo, which is a green frog that appears on a lot of different products as well. And these eco-labels can be really important for helping to drive purchasing patterns in a certain way. But when a new eco-label comes to the market, it can take a long time for consumers to build up knowledge of these eco-labels. And so biodiversity literacy is a slow process. And Consumers International has just done a recent report with the UN Environment Programme called Can I Recycle This? And it looks at the impact of plastic pollution on the environment, which has incredibly negative consequences for biodiversity. So it's already known today that there's 200 species that are negatively affected by plastic pollution in just the marine environment. And there's many, many other food chains in the terrestrial environment that are affected too. And so our report calls for better plastics labelling as a simple and powerful way to help consumers to reduce plastic pollution. Because if consumers can see really clear, reliable information, then it can help them to buy more recyclable and recycled products, and also to dispose of them in the correct way. So it's important to inform consumers about the impact of their choice on biodiversity on the planet, but there's lots of different creative ways that we can do this. Some of you may have heard of Ant Forest. So that rewards consumers for green behaviour, such as travelling by public transport or paying for things online or switching to a green energy provider. And it provides consumers with credits, and these credits can be built up, and then a tree is planted on behalf of that consumer. And then consumers can view the actual tree that has been planted via satellite images. And in 2017, a couple of years after Ant Forest was first implemented, there were 200 million users of Ant Forest, and that equates to almost 3% of the world's population. And it represents a form of gamification which can help biodiversity conservation and the planting of trees to be fun and an easy choice for consumers. And Consumers International has also done a lot of practical campaigning on biodiversity, and we're involved with the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, who was just the previous speaker, along with Cuts International, in the global campaign called the Green Action Week, which is a campaign promoting sustainable consumption through engaging consumers around a specific theme. And several of our organisations have implemented projects to do with biodiversity conservation. For example, our Consumers Association member in Malaysia, the Consumer Association of Penang, has set up a seed sharing fair amongst farmers to tackle the problem of decreasing levels of biodiversity by promoting seed saving and the promotion of more traditional hardy varieties of seeds. And looking to Togo, the Consumer Association there has also tried to fight against the disappearance of medicinal plant biodiversity, which is incredibly important to consumer health. And so they've tried to implement ways of increasing the biodiversity and choice of medicinal plant varieties that are available in Togo. And coming to a close, we're all facing a global pandemic here, and I think, as has previously been mentioned as well, COVID-19 makes acting for nature and biodiversity conservation even more urgent today. COVID-19 is affecting consumers everywhere. Just before this call started, we were having an informal conversation about the huge economic impacts and the health impacts of this pandemic. And so consumer associations across the globe are trying their best to protect consumers, to halt the spread of infection, reduce deaths, but also protect consumers from the damaging economic impacts of the pandemic. And biodiversity conservation is something that should go hand in hand with that. We've got the opportunity here to build back a better system, to not go back to business as usual. And that means protecting the environment, biodiversity, and consumer health for us all, because it'll make a stronger world and that'll make us all happier and healthier. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi, for explaining how biodiversity is important for consumers, and also telling us, about some of the activities, campaigns of the Consumers International, especially the eco-labeling and the Green Action Week. And also, especially concluding by saying that, we need to build the biodiversity once the lockdown is over, business is not as usual. We have to go back with all care. That is very important to know. We will come back with the questions. I'm not sure Dr. Balakrishna is there with us.
Yes.
Dr. Balakrishna?
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Balakrishna Pashupati is the chair of FLEDGE, which is the global think tank, and also he is the regional vice chair of IUCN Commission on Education for the South and Southeast Asia. He will be talking about nature-based solutions. Over to Dr. Balakrishna.
Thank you, Dr. George, and thanks to CUTS. Happy World Environment Day. And as you can imagine, there is a huge rush in terms of dozens of webinars, dozens of reports being launched, some being provided. But of course, for a lot of us who are a part of this particular session, as well as others, every day is an International Biodiversity Day or International Environment Day or World Environment Day. Of course, 2020 is named as the super year for biodiversity. And the reason being that, as George mentioned, that this year culminates in the current global targets on not just reducing loss of biodiversity, but stopping loss of biodiversity, and also beginning a new decade in terms of how do we want to protect biodiversity in nature. So everything this year is centered around biodiversity, everything is centered around nature conservation. We actually, in a few weeks' time, should have had the World Conservation Congress of IUCN, a global meeting to bring together governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and this year should have also marked the 15th Conference of Parties with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also, like in 2010, when the Decade for Biodiversity was launched by the UN General Assembly, the Secretary General of the United Nations is also organizing a Heads of State Summit, a Leaders Summit on Biodiversity this year. So biodiversity is receiving a lot of attention. So everybody speaks about biodiversity, but there are actually a set of mixed signals out there in terms of what we are doing to biodiversity. Of course, if you look at the reports, whether it is the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, or any other report, or the IUCN Red Listing report, one thing is very clear, that in spite of billions of dollars of investment in terms of good intentions of politicians and great work done by conservationists, the rate at which we are losing biodiversity has been immense. And we just celebrated a couple of years ago, 25 years of the Convention on Biological Diversity, one of the global conventions, a legally binding convention with 196 countries as parties. But unfortunately, the intentions are not matching the actions on the ground. And that is quite worrisome. There was also a mention of the ecosystems, the bioecosystem, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity report. 10 years since the TEEB report was launched, countries like India have had their national studies on TEEB. We even had very famous economists like Sir Partha Dasgupta, who provided a report to the Ministry of Finance on how to rejig the way we calculate the gross domestic product, GDP, but action seems to be quite limited. But having said that, we conservationists are always very optimistic. Not that we are losing the race a little, but we are very optimistic that we will definitely win the race, because it is not just run against the time, but it is run for humanity and run for people. And what the current pandemic has demonstrated is, in as much as biodiversity provides for life, but biodiversity can also threaten the entire existence of human population on this planet. Just one microscopic organism is able to bring the entire world to its knees and economies to a standstill, is something which is going to be a very, very stark example of how we cannot ignore the potential of life around us. Having said that, today there was an announcement that was made by an organization called the Global Footprint Network. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. The Global Footprint Network does every year calculation of how countries globally as well as nationally are using their natural assets in terms of providing for their consumption. And they have predicted that this year, August 22nd is going to be the World Footprint Day. So which means that as of August 22nd, globally, we would have used all the natural assets, including biodiversity, that we should have used until 31st of December. But the only positive aspect of this year is that, unlike last year, this year, the date comes almost 3 weeks later. So last year, 2019, it was 3 weeks earlier. So which means that we used up the natural resources of this planet 3 weeks earlier than August 22nd. Thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the lockdown, environment seems to be receiving some attention. The environment seems to be kicking back to life. 14.8% of the carbon emissions have been cut because of the lockdown and because of the pandemic. But many of us are aware that these are very, very temporary issues. Once the economies are going to be opening up, countries are going to run in for a huge rush in terms of economic recovery, in terms of development, creating jobs, ensuring use of resources. So the biggest worry for a lot of people like us who work both nationally and globally on issues of biodiversity conservation and environmental management is that how is that we are going to be reducing the speed with which we are going to be using our resources. The consumption patterns is going to be something very, very important. And that is where we actually need to work both at national and global levels on recovery that is green, recovery that is biodiversity friendly. And that is why, as we build back better, the 3 Bs, which is the buzzword around, it's not building back better just for environment and the social component, but it's also building back better for conservation and environment as well. And if we want to achieve that, 3 things are very, very important. One, having realized that our investments in science still is not helping us as much as possible in terms of trying to deal with how we are able to manage our biodiversity, what is very, very important for us to understand is that we need to change our behaviors. Unless behavioral change, unless social sciences also find an important role and play in the way we manage our policies, our ability to deal with biodiversity conservation will be slowly losing this. Behavioral change and social sciences need to be mainstreamed into the way we deal with conservation and environmental management. The second point is that biodiversity conservation cannot be managed by a few experts and few governments. It has to be a citizen movement. It has to be a citizen science. And that is where people's involvement is going to be absolutely important. And the third and last point I'd like to mention is that in as much as we are looking at nature, nature provides for a lot of opportunities. We have learned a huge amount of lessons at the local level. But our challenge is how do we consolidate those successes and how do you scale up so that the impacts of nature-based solutions can benefit not just humans, but also the nature in itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishna, especially starting by saying how 2020 is a super year for biodiversity, and also explaining how the intentions are not matching on the ground set during the decade. And also you have mentioned when the biodiversity is providing for the survival of humanity, how a small microorganism or virus had brought the world into a standstill. You have mentioned about the Earth Overshoot Day and had given the tips for rebuilding the thing. Especially, you have mentioned, underlined the need for biodiversity cannot be the agenda of few experts, and it has to be a citizens' movement. Now the speeches are over. We will open up for questions and answer. Try to introduce yourself and try to be very brief. And if the questions are specifically addressed to any of the speakers, please mention that. I could see Dr. Priya want to ask a question. Yeah. Her question is, the entire world witness rejuvenated environment post-pandemic. What are the measures being taken to secure it? Any of you, one of you can respond. Dr. Balakrishna, can you respond to that?
Yes, I mean, of course, as I said, that we have to be optimistic. It will bounce back. We will definitely have better life. But the only difference is that it cannot be and will not be business as usual. What this particular pandemic had taught us is that our ability to increase our resilience to this kind of a thing is questionable. The link between environment and health is something that should receive more and more attention. Public health spending has to increase. And lastly, and most importantly, policy making cannot just be focusing on economic recovery and social development. It has to also consider environmental management. So if we're able to have that particular balance and ensure that the lesson that we have learned from this pandemic in terms of our interdependency with nature, but also our shortcomings as a superior element of biodiversity, if we are able to unlearn those lessons, I think we should be able to bounce back very quickly.
Thanks, Dr. Balakrishna. Any one of you want to respond? Maria?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question very briefly, because I lost the link, the internet link, for a few seconds, the beginning of the question.
Yeah. The question is mainly how we can rebuild once the pandemic situation is over.
No, I think we have to go back to the root causes and address the root causes. And as the previous speaker was saying also, we need to link environment and health. We're working in silos. Also, in terms of science, we're working in silos. So we need to merge these two aspects and thereby address the whole problem that we are facing right now. And we need to have a transformative change. We should not go back to what it was like before, because this is what we have been causing in the way we have been living and the way we have been exploiting nature. So I think this need to be a very, very severe reminder on how to go about it within the nearby future, not go back to the same tracks.
Yeah. Thanks, Maria. Any response from Anupa? Naomi, you want to say something?
I just completely agree that this is an opportunity to build back better. I think in the sustainability arguments of the past few years, we've kept saying that we need to not return to business as usual. And look, this is a chance where the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a huge rupture to business as usual, and we've all been interrupted. So maybe let's not seek to go straight back to normality, and seek to build this new normality with biodiversity conservation and sustainable consumption production at its heart.
Yeah. I have another question. Thanks, Naomi. That is, people are well educated. This is in connection with Dr. Balakrishna's point that biodiversity conservation has to be a people's movement, a citizens' movement. So the question is, people are educated but not sensitized towards environmental protection. So how to sensitize the people?
An interesting question, because I was on another webinar just an hour ago where the focus has been on experiential learning. There is a lot of difference being educated and being experienced. So unless you experience nature, unless you are able to be a part of it, being educated is not going to make any sense, or being educated is not going to make any difference. So what is important for people to understand is that they have to experience nature. And again, as I mentioned in my intervention, people's behavior have to change. And many times, the behavior of educated people and the behavior of local communities with respect to managing the resources are completely different. The only reason being that, not a general statement, but overall, local communities live with nature. They know the value of nature. They know what is going to happen if they lose that diversity. Whereas people who are removed from nature have very little experience of what it means not to have that resource. So being educated doesn't mean that you are conscious. You have to have the experience, and you have to learn to live with nature. And unfortunately, our education system does not provide you that particular opportunity yet.
Thanks, Dr. Balakrishna. Anyone else? Maria, want to add to that? Oh. Yeah. Otherwise, I will move to the next question. This question was asked by Sunil. And another question from Abhishek Srivastava. He is mentioning, maybe Naomi can respond to that. We talk about sustainable products and eco-labeling and all, but when we go to buy, such products are not available in many countries, including India. And also the companies are providing misleading information, like, they are selling product which is harmful to the wider environment and things like that. So how we can address this problem?
Thank you. And yes, definitely, it's a huge problem. This greenwashing, it's called, when companies are providing misleading or false information about sustainability in order to drive purchasing patterns and sound appealing to consumers. So there's kind of a two-pronged strategy to that, is that you can work on both the legislation, so trying to get governments and policymakers to make legislation that makes reliable information mandated on different products. So following third-party certification schemes like eco-labels, which have been verified by both internally by an organisation and then also an external party carrying out an audit to check that certain criteria is truly being met. And it's also about forming the communication that consumers see in a really reliable and accessible way. And the UN has a few documents about guiding information provision to consumers. There's also some voluntary codes that businesses can follow, for example, like the International Chamber of Commerce have some guidelines on how to market and advertise products in a really reliable way in order to reduce that misleading information that's out there. And also I think there is a bit of a responsibility for consumers. I know it takes time and the burden seems to be on the consumer, but if consumers can spend some time, for example, researching certain aspects that are important to them to buy in their purchasing patterns, is it organic food, is it products that are cruelty-free in terms of toiletries, if they can investigate certain criteria that are important to them and what the eco-labels and information for them are to look out, then that can really help to steer purchasing patterns in a certain way. But I think overall it has to be a solution is businesses, governments and consumers all working together to form a really reliable information base.
Just one point, if I may add on that question, is that it is also about availability, choice, and affordability. Currently, the biggest challenge for many of us, including in India, is the affordability. So unless some of these products are going to be available where consumer has a choice, but also the prices become affordable, it's going to take a long time for this entire thing to penetrate into this system.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks, Dr. Balakrishna. We will take one more question. This question is about the low level of awareness among the people in a country like India. How we can educate them about the importance of biodiversity. And also Maria also had mentioned that about 70% of the poor people depend upon the biodiversity for their existence. So when poverty is there and people are unaware about the importance of preserving the biodiversity, how you can move forward, what is the way forward?
That's a very interesting question. 2010, there was a ministerial panel that was organized where the presentation of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity report was also made. Sawan Sukhdev, who is the facilitator of this particular report, made a presentation. And there was a very interesting question that was asked, saying that if biodiversity is worth so many trillions of dollars, and if biodiversity occurs in countries where there are 17 megabiodiverse countries in this world, but a significant amount of people in these countries where the biodiversity is most diverse are plentifully available are still poor. So if biodiversity is worth so many trillions, and if these countries have so much of biodiversity, and we've been working on this for the last 30, 40 years, where is the disconnect? Why still people are poor? And of course, the answer was very, very simple. And of course, coming from an economist, the response was that, look, what we are providing you in terms of the numbers of dollars of worth of biodiversity and ecosystem services are the potential of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It is important to translate that potential into something real. And if we do not translate the potential into real, countries and communities that actually manage and have enormous amounts of biodiversity still will continue to remain poor. And that is where the three elements of sustainable development, social, economic, and environmental, should come into play. You can't have sound bites only about so many trillions of dollars of worth of biodiversity is there. But then we also need to translate that potential into something real. And if that translation doesn't happen in real time at the local level, we still will have only academic discussions on using the potential of biodiversity for human development.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishna. And this question was from my colleague, Madhusudan. Maria, you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that it's a very complex question. I think we have to emphasize the way that economic is also based on healthy ecosystems. It will be very costly in the future. We have a risk now in the light of the pandemic that we focus a lot of jobs, we focus on the economy, rather than actually see the link that if we don't address the root causes, we will have even more and higher costs in the nearby future even. So I think we have to put together these pictures and stop working in silos, also from the environmental side.
Thank you, Maria. A quick question: post-pandemic, what should be the 5 focus areas for the consumers or the citizens, linking with the biodiversity? This question is from Preeti Shah from CERC Ahmedabad. Dr. Balkrishna, quick response.
Yes, 5 things. First,
Yeah.
we have to see a change in consumer behavior.
Yeah.
The behavior should be based on reducing our dependency on nature and natural resources for our daily needs to the extent possible. The second one is the point that I mentioned: how do we translate the enormous potential of nature so that it contributes more meaningfully to development at the local level? The third point is that behavior should change in terms of our attitude to connect with nature, understand nature, and live with nature, but being very respectful and being very responsible. The fourth point is that in spite of enormous amounts of finances that are being spent, we still are not reached in levels of efficiency where $1 investment in conservation is giving us the appropriate returns. So we also need to make our adjustments in terms of how do we get the cost benefit analysis of biodiversity conservation better understood. And lastly and importantly, if people are not going to realize and feel the loss of biodiversity at an individual level, we will have a similar webinar in 2050, and we'll be talking about 80% or 90% of biodiversity being lost.
Thank you, Dr. Balkrishna, for that 5 focus areas. Naomi, want to add anything to that?
I don't think I could put it as well as that. There are 5 very good points. I think as well, just throughout all of those 5 points, thinking about the engagement of different stakeholders. So is it engaging consumers through certain awareness and education and information? Is it about engaging governments to try and make pro-policies and regulations that set certain things? Is it about businesses deciding to produce and behave in a certain way?
Yeah. Thank you, Naomi. I think we have exceeded our time. Due to the paucity of time, we will conclude here, though some of the more questions are coming up. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers, Secretary General of CUTS International for his, Mr. Mehta for his opening address, and also all the 5 speakers, Dr. Balkrishna, Maria, Anubha Prasad, and also Naomi. And we were having about 60 people attending this webinar from different states of India and various countries. I also take this opportunity to thank all of you who had attended this program. Once again, thank you so much for all the speakers for your valuable inputs and the information that you have shared. Thank you. We will conclude the webinar here. Bye-bye.
George, I'd like to ask something. It's possible that you can send me the conclusions of this Zoom.
Sure. We will be sending the summary report of this webinar to all the participants.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.